Hello, everybody. Well, first of all, I hope you're all having a great day. Now, diving into the presentation, what do I want to talk about today? Well, I'll be exploring the idea of risk, reward, and the human desire to explore the unknown. How did I become interested in this topic? Well, after taking a class called Horror and Hermes, Literature of the Cult with Professor Morazzini at Boston University, I became very interested in this topic because it's so complex. And I started to explore this topic when I centered around the idea of questioning what is called occult horror. What is occult? What is horror? Well, let's first start with some definitions. So, moving into that, we're going to start with how do we define the occult? So, when I went into my research deep dive of looking into this, all I could find is that across dictionaries, there's just so many different ways to define the occult. And I think that's because it's so complex, which is kind of ironic because when we look at the main underlying definition of what the occult is, it's to remain unknown and to be mysterious. But ironically, the definition in itself is kind of ambiguous and mysterious and unknown. So now when we're thinking about that though, what is the occult? What can we think of when we think of the occult? Well, the occult encompasses all the hidden power and knowledge that makes it difficult for humans to control or comprehend the world that we live in. Think about all the supernatural forces or things in nature or even religious beliefs that you may hold that you can't necessarily explain, but you want to be able to. And the occult, it seems to have that it has a grip on people. People are very fascinated by it. But before we dive into that topic, now let's move on to our next definition. So, like I said, we're exploring what is occult horror. So we also have to explore what is horror. When we think about horror, I normally like to think of a horror movie. And we think about characters in this and what happens to them, and thrillers as well. You think about the main underlying emotion, and it seems to be fear and danger. Now, how do we connect this to the occult, though? So, a lot of times, like I said, the occult can encompass anything that's hidden and powerful, and the supernatural just does just exactly this. So when we think about this, horror often depicts the dangerous consequences of exploring the unknown. Think about all those times in a horror movie where a character walks into a room they're not supposed to walk into, or something bad happens, or a character's in the forest and it's really scary and it's late at night and you don't know what's going on. So use that as your foundation to start off from there. But now we're going to go into investigating the two topics together. So how did I decide to go about this? I realized that there's this underlying theme of why do humans explore the occult if it is so often associated with horror, danger, and risk? Like I said, so many of us will see these horror movies and you see these characters going into it again and again and again, and we just think to ourselves, like, oh, I would never do that. But we say that, and then ironically, it happens throughout our everyday lives. We do it all the time. But now in exploring that, why do humans do that? So first I wanted to dive into, when I was doing my research paper, I wanted to think about the idea of, okay, the occult, what drives humans to it? Why are they interested in it? Well, the occult is a space that evokes curiosity. And when we think about curiosity, we get like this motivation, desire to do something, to act. But at the same time, like I said, it's often portrayed as a horror narrative in which fear, risk, destruction, and consequences and exploration, and you don't know if your life will be on the line or your friend's life will be on the line or something else will happen. So why do we do it? Well, curiosity offers reward of discovering knowledge and power. And this is very enticing to human beings. If you know that, yes, there's a risk that maybe a monster will attack me or maybe something bad will happen, but that risk is only 10%, then you'd probably do it, right? Well, this is the exact thing. Humans evolved to balance risk and reward, although we'll quickly learn that humans don't always accurately do this calculation the right way. But that being said, the Occult overall is an exploratory space where humans consistently make risk and reward calculations. So I wanted to look into this topic, and the first thing I had to do was, be a nerd and go into some risk and reward psychology. So I did some research, and I was mostly looking into the questions of why does curiosity frequently outweigh caution? And why do humans explore the unknown? Because we think about all those times in the horror movies where characters willingly step into those rooms, and you're wondering, okay, they probably know that there's like an 80% chance that there's something bad on the other side, but meanwhile, their curiosity still gets them. And this is exactly this. This is a miscalculated risk and reward assessment. So then we're looking into that. Why do humans explore the known, given that sometimes there's more danger involved than reward? Well, we're going to jump right into the idea of the information gap theory and dopamine and novelty seeking. So when I was looking into my paper, I got some research articles, and the information gap theory is this idea that humans have this little bit of knowledge about a topic, and they soon realize that they want to know more about the topic, and there's a lot of things that they don't understand. And it's that idea of not knowing that makes them feel like there's these feelings of deprivation. This is a theory proposed by George Lowenstein. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right. But it's this feeling of deprivation. And that deprivation emotion is what we label curiosity. So that desire to fulfill that void of what we don't know is what actually drives us to act. And that is the curiosity fueling our behavior to seek new information. But going into our second topic, there's not always like a clear reward involved. And why do humans feel the need to seek knowledge if there's not a clear reward? Well, it turns out that the dopamine receptors in our brain, which is related to feelings of happiness when we think of dopamine, it's actually proven that when you satisfy your curiosity, you actually get feelings of pleasure. So it's genuinely a good feeling to know that, wow, I just discovered something new. And on top of it, in the potential of feeling that way, that's what drives humans to explore the unknown. So now when we're going into this topic, setting that foundation with the research, I wanted to go into this main idea. So the occult is often explored because curiosity over fear or caution drives behavior. And then going into that, curiosity often drives individuals to pursue hidden knowledge or power at the expense of the risks involved. And when we think about that, what does that lead to? Well, as a result, narratives often portray exploring the occult as a cautionary tale because humans miscalculate risk and reward when confronting uncertainty. So this often results in the risks outweighing the rewards, in destructive outcomes. And I think a lot of times narratives like to portray this cautionary tale because they want to warn humans about this this false risk reward assessment that we constantly make, and hopefully through storytelling to convey to people to maybe double check your calculation. So when we want to get a visual on this to fully understand how this happens, we think about it and we go, okay, so a person gets an idea about something and they're curious, so they want to explore the unknown. Apologies for spelling, I'm realizing that's messed up. It's not explorating, it's exploring. But then we now go into, okay, how does exploration, like what is the drive behind exploring? Well, you want to pursue some hidden knowledge or power, and that's the idea of this information gap again. And why is this discovering this hidden knowledge or power so enticing? Well, it often involves a reward, and that reward is going to be feelings of pleasure and discovering this and feeling good about yourself. But notice how in this calculation, there's no mention of risk, danger, or consequences, and none of them are considered because people just often look past them. So next when going into this, I wanted to see how this could be portrayed across narratives, and I decided to start with literature. And in realizing a topic that I was frequently portrayed against and very pertinent to my class on horror and the occult, I discovered, what is Gothic literature? Well, Gothic literature is a genre of writing that features elements of both the occult and horror, and it frequently portrays exploring the unknown as a cautionary tale, like we mentioned, and this often includes supernatural elements. So when we go into this and we think about it, what is Gothic literature as a cautionary tale? Well, I decided to analyze 3 works: The House in the Brain, The Birthmark, and Ligeia, and they're all by the featured authors I mentioned on the very left column. And when we think about this, you can see that there's a clear reward sought, and then there's a clear risk involved, and then there's a clear consequence. And this is just one main consequence of the story. There's often multiple, but you can see in this is that it's a sacrifice of empathy led to in the pursuit of knowledge, and the sacrifice of life for the reward of perfection, and the sacrifice of morality and immortality, the sacrifice of morality for this pursuit of immortality. And it's always about this idea of conquest and beating something beyond human comprehension. And what is that? Well, that's the occult. So now when we decided to go into that, I realized that there's this clear theme. And it seems so that horror, cautionary tale seems to be a one-on-one relationship. But I decided that the real way to test this theory is, well, would I see this across different mediums? Would I see this in art? Would I see this in movies? Would I see this in film? Well, I did exactly that. So next I moved on to exploring the occult across different frameworks. And I noticed something very interesting. So when I first moved on to classic movies and big franchises that are super, super popular, I first thought of Jurassic Park. And interestingly enough, the motive remained the exact same. It was in this desire to achieve hidden scientific power or knowledge. Think about it. They wanted to resurrect dinosaurs and get them back from the dead and bring this park that would bring in major financial freedom and give them so much credit, and the world would love them for it. But what was driving this thing? Well, the scientists, and specifically Dr. Hammond, which is the CEO of the park, was very arrogant in this. Dr. Ian Malcolm, a main character, constantly warns them about this idea of chaos theory and not being able to control nature, but they completely ignore it. The whole premise is based on this idea that these scientists then decide to have these people come to the park to basically verify that the park is safe for legal reasons. But ironically, that obviously does not get proved, and it's this arrogance that leads to having more risk than reward. And this makes this a horror narrative. But then we think about a different framework. And I thought about things like Captain America. We all love Captain America, but how did Captain America get his supernatural capabilities? Well, he decided to take this really mysterious serum. And we heard the word mysterious and buzzword. What does that bring you to? The occult. But he did it at this expense of, he wanted to save people and he wanted to help the country. And we all know he was even selected for it, in the movie at least, because he dove on a bomb. And so in doing this, he was a person that was willing to risk his own life in the expense of others. And unlike the other stories where frequently they were willing to risk life for their own personal reward, it was this exact opposite dynamic that then made it in this narrative where the rewards were outweighing the risks. So this kind of shows that exploring the occult doesn't necessarily always lead to bad outcomes. But what is another way? Because I just talked a lot about exploration. And I wanted to explore the idea too of, well, what if we don't explore the occult? What if we know it's there, but we don't explore it? And well, I discovered quite a cautionary example of this, which is the Salem witch trials. We think about this. People were so scared of this idea that there's a devil and Satan and witchcraft existing throughout Salem that they were so avoidant and they were so determined to just get rid of this perceived evil force that they had in their brains that they would do anything to get rid of it. But in the process, what did this cost? Well, it led to a lot of problems. And this is depicted a lot across visual artworks in particular. We on the first top right corner, we have the accused of witchcraft is a painting. And it's going off this idea of spectral evidence, which was this idea that you could use visions or dreams, like theorized dreams or visions that you saw in a person attack you, and you could use it in court and verify that somebody was a witch as a result of that. But there's no way to disprove that. And we did a really funny example of this in my class as well. Highly recommend taking this class, by the way. But in doing this, we saw that in a reward to just eradicate this evil and to just have clarity on that, like you could feel safe knowing that you condemned a witch and there was one less witch in the town, people actually caused a lot of innocent people to die and to be sentenced and go to jail because they wanted this desire to feel safe so badly that they didn't want to explore the unknown. They didn't want to understand it. They just wanted to get rid of it. And now we're going into the next one, the next consequence, which was in The Crucible. So The Crucible is a fictionalized version of the Salem witch trials. It does depict a lot of the events accurately as well. So it's a mix of both. It's a mixed bag. Definitely recommend doing some research beforehand so you can know what's real versus what's fictionalized. But in displaying this, as you can see too, I love this little artwork that is from The Crucible. You can see it's almost like a playmaster, like playing with puppets in his hands, because that's exactly it. People in power saw that the people in the town, the Puritan town of Salem, were so terrified of Satan that they could, and this is bad, exert control and power by using this fear to manipulate people. And whether that was you wanted land, or you wanted to be in a relationship, or you wanted to uphold your presence as a judge or a religious figure, it led to a lot of people also dying because their own personal motives, they used this exact idea of actually manipulating the unknown to their advantage. And now, and going through all of this, what are my main takeaways on exploring this topic of what is called occult horror through the lens of risk and reward? Well, I figured out that individuals explore the occult in the rewarding possibility of obtaining hidden power and knowledge. This is always the underlying motive across like the board. And even in the Salem witch trials, although they're not exploring it, it was still that idea of receiving power and control, and maybe not so much knowledge, but definitely getting power, that they were driven to exploit the occult. Not necessarily exploring it, but exploiting it. And now when we think about this, again, going off that topic, the Salem witch trials, because they weren't exploring it, this means that the horror is not necessarily in exploring the occult itself. Because we also saw that in this Captain America narrative that he did explore the occult. He was willing to take this mysterious serum that the doctors clearly labeled that was very dangerous and could kill him, but he was actually rewarded. He turned into the superhero that now everybody loves. But then, so when we think about this, why does horror emerge when we think about its connection to the occult? Well, when people pursue or fear, like we saw in the Salem witch trials, the unknown, in ways that sacrifice their morality, empathy, and human life, they basically means that when they lose their moral compass, this is when it results in horror. This is when it results in consequence. It's all about the intentionality and actionality and combining it together to lead to outcomes. And now finally, the biggest takeaway is that destruction often results from how people choose to act when pursuing and using power. So it's how people decide that they want to use this knowledge that they're going to gain from the occult, or how they're going to use this power, that often leads to the outcomes that they're going to face. And like I said, just drive yourself with a good moral compass, and you should be able to avoid the horror that's involved with the occult. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you. Bye.